Tulsa anniversary. And to continue our coverage of Pride Month, we're joined now by ABC News contributor LZ Granderson. He just launched the ABC News podcast Life Out Loud with LZ Granderson, which he describes as a, quote, a letter to the queer kid who thinks they're alone, and also to everyone who needs a safe space or wants to learn about why having a space is important. Thanks, as always, for coming on the show, LZ.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get to your podcast, let's discuss the legacy of the Tulsa Massacre. A lawsuit was filed, as you know, against the city of Tulsa, and last week 3 of the survivors and their descendants gave emotional testimonies in Congress asking for acknowledgement and reparations. In our current political climate, what do you think the likelihood of success is for these kinds of calls for reparations?
Well, if we're looking at the way that the Democrats are handling things thus far, I would say not so good. I don't mean to be doom and gloom, but the reality is that if the people who champion your causes aren't committed to helping you to the fullest extent of its power, then when you start talking about compromise and you start talking about negotiations, you're really starting from a disempowered position to begin with. So my attention is actually turned more towards corporate America and whether or not corporate America will step up and try to address some of these wrongs. Because unfortunately, for our elected officials right now, I see a lot of cowardliness, but I don't see a lot of courage.
As you know, we just marked the more than a year since George Floyd's murder sparked protests in all 50 states. Do you think today that we're doing a better job of addressing the darker parts of our history, such as the Tulsa Massacre?
I'm not quite sure if we're addressing it now. I mean, you just mentioned the lawsuit. We heard about the testimony. This is still the information gathering stage. This is still assessing the damage that's been ignored. And this is just one massacre. There have tens and tens of similar massacres that have happened all over this country. So when you think about the extent of this conversation and where we are in simply trying to acknowledge this conversation, the idea that we're addressing the fallout is nonsensical to me because we haven't even assessed the damage.
And let's turn to the ABC News podcast, Life Out Loud with LZ Granderson. The podcast, the first guest was Stephen Canals, the co-creator of the FX show Pose. Let's take a listen.
Stephen, there are so many lessons, beautiful lessons that you were sharing with us over these 3 seasons. And I'm just curious as to what was the one big lesson that you took away from this journey?
That is a great question. You know, I think that one of the lessons for sure that I've learned from working on this show is to stand unapologetically in my truth, to never dim my shine for anybody. I think for me, standing unapologetically in my truth means to allow Stephen to exist in all of his fullness, in all of his complexities, in all of his contradictions, because all of that is beautiful.
And what did you make of his answer, especially at the start of this project?
It was everything. It was absolutely everything. You know, particularly for queer people of color, this conversation regarding intersectionality has always been a messy one. We want your contributions, but we don't want you to be too gay. We want you to be too gay, but we don't want you to be too black. Like, there's always seems to have been a willingness to accept one aspect of ourselves, which usually causes us to quiet down or ignore another aspect of our being. And just hearing Stephen acknowledge that struggle and talk about overcoming that struggle, even again just now, really touches me. Because I myself, as a queer person of color, knows what it's like to try to juggle these different sort of aspects of my identity in a world that likes to be black and white and not have intersectionality be part of the conversation. I'm also extremely proud of Stephen. I've told him that on the podcast. I've said that to him in private, because this is someone who took 166 no's and he never stopped trying. He never stopped knocking on doors. He believed in this project. He believed in the stories of these characters. He believed in the importance of having trans women of color be showcased in this light. And because he believed in us so much as a community, he's now reaping the benefits, but it could not have been easy. So he embodies his statement of not letting his shine dim any, but he also inspires through his statement because he's living proof of what happens when you don't lower yourself so that others can feel taller.
That persistence paying off there. And as we said earlier, you described the podcast as a letter to a host of people, including a younger version of yourself. You say you used to deny who you were and that you used to bully others. What messages do you hope that young listeners in particular get from your podcast that perhaps you didn't hear growing up?
There are a lot of messages there. The example that you gave in terms of bullying other queer people is something that I'm embarrassed about, but I want it to be truthful because I want this podcast to be as transparent and as honest as possible. And I figured it was important that I began with myself. I also wanted to let those other queer kids in school know that if you find yourself in this situation, there are other aspects to this larger conversation in terms of self-hate that is at play, and to kind of be cognizant or aware of that. But I also wanted this podcast and this letter, if you will, to both my younger self as well as the young people of today, to let them know that, yes, things do get better. I'm living proof that it gets better. I remember applying for jobs in sports. I remember one of the hiring editors looking me in the eye, telling me that I was a really good reporter and writer, but he couldn't send a faggot into the locker room during a job interview. Today, I work for the worldwide leader in sports. It was not easy. I'm not trying to pretend as if it was easy getting here. I'm not trying to pretend it's easy being here. But what I am saying is that I got here. So for any young person who is struggling right now with their gender identity or sexual orientation or some other aspect of their being, keep being you, believe in the gifts that God is giving you, and know that if you stay the course, if you just believe in yourself long enough, things will get better. I am living proof of it.
And also, I like that question that you begin your interviews with. You say, when did you remember something other than straight? Why did you decide that was going to be the recurring question?
Because I thought it was a very good place to start for everyone. Regardless of gender identity, regardless of sexual orientation, we all remember the first time we encountered someone who wasn't cisgender or who wasn't straight. Or we encountered an aspect of society that wasn't representative of a cisgender or heterosexual normative sort of lifestyle. We all remember. So I thought it was a great question to start because it kind of puts us all on the same level playing field. And usually the answer that I've gotten thus far through season 1, 10 or younger. 10 years old or younger is the first time they were exposed or became aware of, which makes this push to rid schools of LGBTQ history absolutely ridiculous, considering that children in elementary school are cognizant of this element of society, and we have elected officials so afraid of people who are different that they're trying to pretend as if we aren't there, when kids are smart enough to even see it.
LZ Granderson, always a pleasure to talk to you. You can listen to Life Out Loud on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.